Welcome to Noir channel. We are about to present to you The Last Will of Sir Henrik Falk, a traditional murder mystery story. Enjoy! Cadfael adjusted the strap of his canvas satchel as the jet bridge shuddered against the fuselage. The scent of jet fuel and disinfectant hung thick in the cabin air, mixing with the faint aroma of stewed prunes from the meal trolley parked near row 12. Hugh stood in the aisle beside him, one hand braced against the overhead bin, watching the flow of passengers with a steady, assessing gaze. A flight attendant in a crisp navy uniform offered a tight smile as she guided them toward the exit, her heels clicking on the metal grating outside. The tarmac shimmered under a late afternoon sun. Heat rose in ripples from the concrete. The airport sprawled with a low, constant hum of engines, distant announcements, and the occasional burst of laughter from a reuniting family near the baggage claim. Cadfael inhaled deeply. The dry air carried traces of oil and distant desert sand. He stepped onto the moving walkway that carried them toward the terminal. Hugh fell into step beside him, shoulders relaxed, but eyes scanning the crowd with a practitioner's ease. He noted the uniformed stewardess directing traffic with a whistle, the businessman arguing loudly into a wall-mounted telephone, the child tugging at her mother's hand while pointing at a model airplane suspended from the ceiling. Cadfael let his gaze drift to the shops lining the concourse, newsstands stacked with faded newspapers, a duty-free display of crystal decanters and tins of Danish butter cookies, a travel agency poster promoting sun-drenched villas in the Algarve. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting a flat, even glow over the polished terrazzo floor. A man in a rumpled linen suit hurried past, briefcase swinging, muttering about a missed connection. Cadfael's fingers brushed the worn leather of his satchel. He felt the familiar bulk of his herbal guide tucked inside. They emerged into the main hall where a cluster of travelers gathered around a departure board, its flip dots clacking softly as destinations updated. Sir Henrik Falk stood near the information desk, engaged in conversation with a man in a sharply tailored gray suit who bore the air of someone accustomed to giving orders. Falk's posture was rigid, his shoulders squared despite his years, his hands clasped loosely in front of him as he listened with a faint frown. The assistant, Derek Vaughan, spoke in low, measured tones, his Welsh accent softened by years of imitation, his eyes flicking occasionally toward Falk's face as if gauging reaction. Vaughan held a leather-bound notebook, its edges worn smooth from constant use, and tapped a finger against the page as he spoke. Falk nodded once, a tight, almost imperceptible motion. He turned toward the escalators with Vaughan falling into step half a pace behind. Hugh leaned slightly toward Cadfael, his voice dropping to a murmur. That's Vaughan, Falk's man for 8 years, never seen him without a notebook. Cadfael watched the pair disappear into the crowd, noting the way Vaughan's left hand lingered a second too long on Falk's elbow before releasing it, a gesture that spoke of habit, not affection. Loyalty like that can be a shield or a dagger, he murmured in reply. A woman in a silk scarf and oversized sunglasses brushed past them, her perfume leaving a sharp trail of jasmine and alcohol. She paused at the newsstand, flipping through a magazine with a distracted air before tucking it under her arm and moving on. Hugh's eyes followed her for a moment, then flicked to a group of men in dark coats standing near the column, their voices low as they exchanged passports and tickets. One of them, taller than the rest, adjusted the knot of his tie with a quick, nervous jerk. A soft voice broke the rhythm of their observation. First time in Dubai? They turned to see a woman standing nearby, her Swedish accent crisp and precise, her gaze steady behind tortoise-shell glasses. She wore a tailored camel coat over a turtleneck, her hands gloved and resting on a slim leather satchel. Ellen Sjostrom, Cadfael recalled from the manifest a hedge fund manager traveling under her own name. No, Hugh said, his tone polite but guarded. We've been before, she nodded once, her lips thinning slightly. The heat agrees with some more than others. Her eyes flicked to Cadfael's tonsured head, then to the cross resting against his chest beneath his shirt. You travel far for a man of the cloth, Cadfael smiled, slow and warm. The cloister sends me where the gardens need tending, or where the sick need tending. She studied him for a beat, then turned her attention to the departure board, as if dismissing the exchange. Kenya, she said without looking at him. Falk's destination. Hugh's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Indeed. The woman's gaze sharpened, just a fraction. He altered his will today. Cadfael felt the words land like a stone in still water, no surprise, no flourish, just fact. Hugh's stare locked onto hers, sharp and assessing. How do you know that? Sjostrom's expression remained flat, her voice devoid of inflection. I read the draft. He showed me. She paused as if weighing whether to continue. He wanted my opinion on the trust clause. Hugh's fingers tapped once against his thigh, a restless cadence. And what did you tell him? She met his eyes then, her gaze direct and unblinking. That it was generous. A beat of silence passed between them, thick with what went unsaid. Then she inclined her head slightly, a farewell that carried no warmth, and stepped away toward the security checkpoint, her heels clicking steadily on the tile. Hugh watched her go, his mind already turning over the implications, his face a closed door. Cadfael and Hugh moved toward the exit, the flow of passengers carrying them toward the sliding doors that opened onto the blazing tarmac. A convoy of black cars waited at the curb, their engines idling softly, chauffeurs in dark uniforms standing at attention beside open rear doors. Falk's vehicle, a large, immaculate sedan with diplomatic plates, sat second in line, Vaughn already inside, arranging papers on the seat beside him. Falk stood by the rear door, speaking briefly with a uniformed officer who saluted sharply before retreating to his post. The sun glinted off the car's chrome trim, blinding for a moment as Falk turned and slid into the back seat. Vaughn closed the door with a soft click, then took his place behind the wheel. The engine hummed to life, a low, steady thrum that vibrated through the soles of their shoes as the car pulled away, merging into the stream of traffic heading toward the highway. They stood for a moment on the curb, the heat rising from the asphalt in shimmering waves, the sound of distant horns and tires on wet pavement filling the air. Cadfael pulled a handkerchief from his pocket, wiping the sweat from his brow with a slow, deliberate motion. Hugh lit a cigarette, the match flaring briefly before settling into a steady glow, the first drag drawing the smoke deep into his lungs. They said nothing as they watched the traffic flow, the city unfolding around them in a haze of heat and motion. The terminal doors sighed shut behind them with a pneumatic hiss, sealing off the cool interior. Somewhere in the distance, a call to prayer echoed faintly over the rooftops, carried on a breeze that smelled of spice and dust. Cadfael exhaled, the smoke from Hugh's cigarette curling around his face before dissipating into the bright, indifferent sky. They began to walk toward the airport's long-term parking lot, their steps falling into an easy rhythm. Hugh flicked ash onto the pavement, his eyes scanning the rows of vehicles with a mechanic's precision. "That sedan," he said, voice sharp over the horn's blast. "It's got a duplicate key. Falk keeps one with Vaughn, one locked in the safe at the manor." Cadfael glanced at him, surprised. "How do you know that?" Hugh shrugged, a small, almost imperceptible lift of his shoulder. "Vaughan mentioned it once. Over drinks," said Falk, "trusts no one else with the spare." A car horn blared nearby, making both men start. Cadfael laughed softly, the sound rough and warm. Trust is a rare commodity in his line of work. Hugh nodded, taking another drag from his cigarette. And yet he gave Vaughn the power to change his will today. They reached Cadfael's rented rover, its paint faded but solid, and paused at the driver's door. The afternoon sun hung low now, gilding the edges of the clouds, and for a moment the world felt suspended, ordinary, quiet, utterly unprepared for what lay ahead. Warm metal and recycled oxygen clung to the cabin air, a constant hum beneath the murmur of voices and the hiss of the pressurization system. Brother Cadfael shifted in his seat. The leather creaked under his weight as he watched Derek Vaughan rise from the row across the aisle. Vaughan moved with quiet efficiency, his steps deliberate as he approached Sir Henrik Falk, who sat rigidly upright in the window seat, his hands resting on the armrests like a man bracing for impact. Cadfael noted the time on his pocket watch, 11:43, just as Vaughan slipped into the galley and returned moments later with the medical kit clasped in his palm. The kit's red cross stood stark against the cream interior, a small beacon of routine in the sterile cabin. Falk did not look up, his gaze fixed on the distant clouds beyond the oval window, his jaw tight with the strain of long hours in the air. Vaughan knelt slightly, his voice low as he spoke, and Falk gave a single nod, almost imperceptible, before accepting what Vaughan offered. It was not the usual white-scored tablet Falk carried in his vest pocket, but a two-part capsule, opaque and filled with a fine white powder that caught the cabin light like ground chalk. Cadfael's brow furrowed, his herbalist's instinct triggering at the unfamiliar form. He had seen Falk take his medication before, always the same tablet, always with water from the small bottle Vaughan kept at his elbow. This was different. This was not medicine as he knew it. Falk tipped his head back, swallowed the capsule without water, and within moments his shoulders began to slack, the rigid military posture dissolving into a sudden heavy drowsiness. His eyelids fluttered, then closed, his head lolling slightly against the headrest, as if the weight of his own skull had become too much to bear. Vaughan's hand lingered on Falk's arm for a beat longer than necessary, his thumb tracing a slow circle on the wool sleeve before he withdrew, his face set in polite concern. Cadfael watched Vaughan slip the empty capsule halves into the cuff of his left shirt, the motion quick and concealed, as if hiding something small and sharp. The gesture was practiced, almost reflexive. It sent a quiet alarm through Cadfael's chest. Not fear, but the sharp recognition of a man who had spent years reading the subtleties of gesture and intent. He turned his face toward the window, pretending to study the Arabian desert far below. His mind raced through the implications, the timing, the substitution, the disposal. Vaughan had not merely given Falk a pill, he had exchanged one substance for another, and done so with the precision of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. The cabin lights dimmed for the night cycle, casting the first-class section into a soft blue glow in that half-light. Cadfael saw Vaughan lean close to Falk's ear and whisper, words lost to the engine's drone but clear in intent, a benediction that sounded like a farewell. Across the aisle, Hugh Berengar sat stiff in his seat, his notebook open on his lap, his pen moving in short, sharp bursts as he questioned Ellen Sjostrom about Falk's will. Her voice was cool, precise, each word measured like a stone placed on a scale. "He asked my opinion," she said, not looking up from her own ledger, "on the trust clause. Said he wanted to know if it was generous." Berengar's pen paused. "And what did you tell him?" "That it was more than generous," she replied, her Swedish accent flattening the vowels. "That it was foolish." She finally met his eyes, her gaze sharp and assessing. He was dying to give it away. Berengar frowned, the corner of his mouth tightening. "Dying metaphorically," she said, but her tone left little doubt she meant it literally. "He's been restless since Nairobi, like a man settling accounts." Berengar nodded slowly, his mind clicking through the pieces. The will change, Vaughan's constant presence, the duplicate key he'd confessed to holding. He glanced across the cabin just in time to see Vaughan's hand disappear into his cuff, the motion too quick to be innocent. Berengar's jaw tightened. He had seen loyalty before, and he had seen obsession. What Vaughan displayed was neither. It was calculation, cold and patient. He made a note in the margin of his notebook. Vaughan's behavior correlated with will alteration. Motive and opportunity. Not proof, but a direction. The hum of the engines filled the silence between them, a steady thrum that made conversation difficult, but Berengar leaned in anyway, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "You think he knew?" Sjostrom shook her head, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "Knew what? That Falk was changing his will? Everyone knew. He'd been talking about it for weeks." Berengar's eyes narrowed. "Not that he wouldn't wake up in Surrey." She stared at him for a long moment, then gave a single, slow shake of her head. "No, I think he hoped he would." The words settled between them, not as accusation, but as possibility. A door cracked open in the dark. Berengar did not press further. He closed his notebook with a soft snap, the sound loud in the hushed cabin, and turned his gaze to the sleeping Falk, his mind already turning over the next question. Who stood to gain most from a man's sudden silence? The cabin lights shifted again, brightening slightly as the flight attendants began their pre-landing checks, and Cadfael opened his eyes, having feigned sleep for the past 20 minutes. He saw Vaughan straighten in his seat. His posture was alert again, his hands folded neatly on his tray table as if nothing had occurred. Falk remained slumped against the window, his breathing shallow, and even his face pale in the artificial light. Cadfael's fingers brushed the rosary beads in his pocket, a habitual gesture of grounding. He thought not of prayer, but of the capsule hidden in Vaughan's cuff, two halves of a shell, empty now, but once holding something that had brought a powerful man to the edge of unconsciousness. He wondered what powder had filled it. Had it tasted bitter or sweet on Falk's tongue? The plane began its slow descent over the Atlantic, the engines pitching to a lower tone. For the first time since boarding, Cadfael allowed himself to feel the weight of what had happened, not as a mystery to be solved, but as an act completed in silence, witnessed only by those who knew how to look. The Surrey police station smelled of damp wool and cold coffee as Beringer pushed through the swing door into the evidence room. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a clinical glare on rows of metal shelving. He pulled on a fresh pair of gloves before approaching the table, where Falk's personal effects lay arranged in neat rows. A white-scored tablet rested beside a crumpled air sickness bag, its corner stained with something dark. Beringer lifted the bag with tweezers holding it to the light. Phenobarbital crystals glinted in the fibers like scattered sugar. Cadfael entered moments later carrying a file thick with notarized documents. He set it down with a soft thump, the paper edges slightly curled from humidity. The will change happened mid-flight, he said, blunt as a scalpel, notarized at 30,000 feet over the North Sea. Beringer did not look up from the bag. Phenobarbital not in Falk's prescription, he murmured. Vaughan had access to it at RAF Ely. Cadfael nodded slowly. 2 opportunities, 1 man. Beringer stood and stretched his shoulders, rolling them back to ease the stiffness from hours of sitting. The garage door locked from inside, he said. Engine running, hose connected to the exhaust. He paced 3 steps, then stopped. Someone had to be in there with Falk to do all that. Cadfael watched him move, noting the sharp angle of his jaw, the tension in his neck. Vaughan claims he was with Falk in town after landing. Beringer's voice dropped. Then, how did he get back here to lock up? Cadfael opened the file to a page stamped with a notary seal and a time code. He didn't need to, he said, tracing the ink with a fingertip. He never left Falk's side. Beringer frowned. Explain. Cadfael slid the paper across. The notary was airborne. Vaughan brought him aboard the plane as a witness. He paused, letting the implication settle. Falk altered his will, drugged, and died all within Vaughan's window of control. Beringer exhaled through his nose. A locked room that never was. A sharp knock came at the door before Ellen Sjostrom stepped inside her coat, still damp from the morning mist. Her eyes flicked to the evidence bag, then to Cadfael's face. "You found something," she stated, not asked. Beringer replaced the bag in its envelope. Phenobarbital residue, he said, in an air sickness bag near Falk's seat. Sjöström's lips tightened. He was nauseous after the capsule. She crossed her arms. Vaughan gave him something that wasn't his medicine. Cadfael watched her hands where they gripped her elbows. You reviewed the will today. Sjöström's gaze shifted to the window where rain streaked the glass in silver threads. He wanted to know if the trust clause was generous, she said. I told him it was foolish. Beringer leaned forward. Foolish how? She did not look at him. It tied his money to a cause he spent his life opposing. Cadfael noted the way her foot tapped once against the leg of the chair. Education for displaced Kikuyu. Sjöström's voice hardened. Falk blocked my tea plantation deal last week. Millions at stake. Beringer's eyes narrowed. Motive? Sjöström pushed off the wall and moved toward the door. I have an alibi, she said over her shoulder. I was with Pierre Lefebvre in the airport lounge after landing. She paused, hand on the handle. We discussed French Algeria files. The door clicked shut behind her. Beringer turned to Cadfael. Lefebvre, Cadfael nodded. Retired DGSE, suspected Falk of blackmail. Beringer ran a thumb along his lower lip. 2 suspects with access to phenobarbital. 1 with motive. Cadfael closed the file and stood his joints creaking softly. We need Vaughn's medical records from Ely. Beringer already reached for the telephone rotary dial, clicking as he turned the number. I'll put in a request, the line crackled, then connected. Beringer spoke in clipped phrases, confirming details, hanging up after a minute. Records sealed. Need a court order. Cadfael smiled without humor. Then we wait. Beringer glanced at the clock. Or we find another way in. The evidence room door opened again, and Vaughan stepped inside, his face pale but composed. He stopped short, seeing the bag on the table. What is that? He asked, voice tight. Beringer did not move. Air sickness bag from Falk's seat. Vaughan's eyes flicked to it, then away. He was airsick. Cadfael stepped forward. You gave him a capsule instead of his tablets. Vaughan's jaw tightened. His medicine made him nauseous. Beringer leaned in. Phenobarbital makes you drowsy, not sick. Vaughan's shoulders rose and fell once. I am his assistant. I know his body. Cadfael tilted his head. You also have access to military hospital phenobarbital. Vaughan's gaze snapped to him, sharp and defensive. I served at Ely. Beringer crossed his arms. You hid the empty halves in your cuff. Vaughan looked down at his left sleeve, smoothing the fabric. I did not want to alarm anyone. Cadfael's voice softened. You alarmed Falk enough to change his will. Vaughan's head came up. I did not influence him. Beringer's tone turned icy. Then explain how you locked the garage from inside with Falk still breathing. Vaughan opened his mouth, closed it, then said nothing. The silence stretched thick and heavy. Vaughan finally spoke, his voice low. I was with him in town. Beringer pushed off the desk. Prove it. Vaughan fell silent for a beat. We had lunch at the White Hart. Vaughan licked his lips. Alibi witness. The waiter. Beringer snorted. A waiter remembers faces, not times. Vaughan's hands clenched at his sides. You have nothing. Cadfael placed a palm flat on the table. We have phenobarbital. We have a will changed mid-flight. We have a locked garage that only makes sense if you never left his side. Vaughan stared at the floor. You are wrong. Beringer nodded once. Then help us prove it. Vaughan lifted his head. I will not speak without counsel. He turned and walked out the door, closing it softly behind him. Beringer watched him go. He's hiding something. Cadfael picked up the file. Or he's protecting someone. Beringer glanced at the clock again. Either way, we need to get inside that garage. Cadfael closed his eyes for a second and find out who really locked the door. The rain had eased to a drizzle as they stepped outside into the gray afternoon. Beringer lit a cigarette, the match flaring bright in his cupped hands. Vaughan's duplicate key, he said, blowing smoke toward the horizon. Could lock the garage from inside. Cadfael nodded. But only if he was already in there. Berengar inhaled deeply, which means he was with Falk when the engine started. Cadfael exhaled through his nose, which means he stayed with Falk from touchdown to garage. Berengar flicked ash onto the pavement. Then the locked garage was never locked from inside. Cadfael looked at him. It was staged, Berengar nodded, to look like an accident. Cadfael paused. Vaughan made it look like Falk killed himself. Berengar's eyes narrowed, or made it look like no one could have done it. Cadfael smiled faintly, a locked room mystery. Berengar crushed the cigarette under his heel. And we just solved the first part. They walked toward the car in silence, the weight of the morning settling on their shoulders like damp wool. Engines thrummed steadily beneath the first-class cabin as passengers settled into their seats with low murmurs of adjustment. Brother Cadfael adjusted the woolen blanket over his knees, the rough fabric scraping against his calloused hands across the aisle. Derek Vaughan sat rigidly upright, his shoulders tense despite the reclined position of his chair. Cadfael watched as Vaughan's fingers tapped a restless rhythm on the armrest, the nails short and clean but trembling slightly with each pulse. The scent of recycled air and faint lavender from a nearby passenger's hand cream mingled with the sharper tang of anxiety. Cadfael leaned forward, his voice low and measured. "You've been quiet since we took off, Vaughan." Falk seemed different after the capsule. Vaughan's eyes flicked to him, a flash of something unreadable passing behind the polished lenses of his glasses. He did not answer immediately, his gaze drifting to the window where the Arabian Sea stretched below, a vast expanse of ink and silver under the midday sun. When he finally spoke, his Welsh lilt had softened, each word deliberate and devoid of contraction. "I did not administer anything outside his prescribed regimen, brother." His hands remained still now, folded precisely in his lap, but the tension in his jaw told another story. The cabin attendant glided past, her trolley clinking softly as she offered drinks. Vaughan declined with a slight shake of his head, his attention snapping back when Falk shifted in his seat, muttering something incoherent under his breath. Vaughan's posture snapped upright, his hand resting lightly on the armrest between them, not to assist, but to assert control, not comfort. The man's pharmacological knowledge was evident in the precision of his movements, yet his calm felt strained, like a wire wound too tight. Cadfael watched Vaughan's hands, still folded, jaw tight, and wondered what secrets he measured in milligrams and microfeconds. Hugh Berengar rose from his seat 2 rows behind, his lean frame unfolding with quiet efficiency. He approached Ellen Sjostrom, who sat rigidly upright, her hands folded over a leather-bound ledger that remained stubbornly closed. The Swedish hedge fund manager's eyes were sharp, assessing, her accent cutting through the cabin's murmur like a blade. Berengar kept his tone light, his Norman wit a shield. "Ms. Sjostrom, may I trouble you for a moment? I'm trying to understand Sir Henrik's state of mind before the will change." She did not look up immediately, her fingers tracing the embossed logo on the cover. "He asked if the trust clause was generous," Sjostrom said finally, her voice flat, each syllable precise. "I told him it was foolish." A flicker of something anger, regret crossed her face before she smoothed it into neutrality. Berengar noted the tension in her shoulders, the way her knuckles whitened where they gripped the ledger. "Falk blocked my tea plantation deal last week, millions at stake." She paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, "He had a habit of discarding useful tools when they became liabilities." The words settled between them like cold iron, heavy with implication. Berengar leaned in, his voice dropping. "And Vaughan? Did he seem involved in that discussion?" Sjostrom's gaze flicked toward Vaughan, then back, her face a closed ledger, unreadable. "He was present, silent, as always." She paused, the corners of her eyes tightening like drawn wire. "But he handled the pill dispenser with unusual care, trembling hands, for a man who claims steadiness." Berengar filed that away, his mind already cross-referencing Vaughan's military medic background with the phenobarbital found in Falk's air sickness bag. The pieces were not fitting, they were grinding. Pierre Lefebvre sat across the aisle, his posture relaxed, but his eyes alert, scanning the cabin with the quiet vigilance of a man used to watching for threats. Berengar approached him next, his tone conversational but his intent sharp. "Monsieur Lefebvre, I understand you were with Falk in Abu Dhabi. Did he mention anything unusual, files, documents?" Lefebvre's French accent softened his words, each one weighed like a coin in the palm. He paused, fingers tightening on his knee as if measuring words against old wounds, then said, "Legacy. It's not what you build, it's what you can't put down." He paused, his gaze drifting to the window. "But he did not show me any papers. If he had such files, he kept them well hidden." The retired DGSE officer's fingers tapped once on his knee, a nervous habit or a signal. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the flight attendants prepared for meal service. Vaughn rose abruptly, his movements stiff, and made his way toward the aft lavatory. Cadfael watched him go, noting the way he paused outside the door, hand resting on the latch as if listening. When he emerged 2 minutes later, his face was pale but composed, his shirt cuff adjusted with deliberate precision. Berengar joined Cadfael in the galley area, both men leaning against the bulkhead as they exchanged quiet observations. "His hands were shaking when he touched the pill case," Cadfael murmured, like he feared what it contained. Berengar nodded, the corners of his eyes tightening like drawn wire. "And he's been closer to Falk in the last hour than at any point since takeoff." A sudden commotion erupted near the rear of the cabin, a flight attendant's voice, sharp with alarm, cutting through the ambient noise. Berengar and Cadfael exchanged a glance before moving forward, their steps swift but silent. The attendant stood frozen in the aisle, her face ashen, pointing toward the lavatory door. Inside, slumped against the wall, was a young woman in a crisp uniform, Falk's personal secretary, her hand clenched around a half-empty vial of phenobarbital capsules, the label torn and illegible. The vial gleamed under the harsh fluorescent light, its contents catching the eye like a promise of sleep or something far darker. Cadfael knelt beside her, his fingers checking for a pulse at her wrist, thready but present. The air smelled of disinfectant and something sweet, almost cloying, from the spilled powder near her feet. Berengar stood over them, his jaw tight, his mind racing not with theories, but with the weight of what lay ahead. The vial in her hand was not Falk's usual medication. It was the same phenobarbital they had found in the air sickness bag. And now it was here, in the hands of someone who should not have had access. The investigation had just taken a turn neither of them had seen coming. The lavatory light buzzed overhead, a harsh fluorescent glare that made the secretary's skin look sallow and the phenobarbital powder on her lips appear almost blue. Zara al-Mansouri stood just outside the door, her Emirati abaya rustling softly as she shifted her weight from foot to foot. She had been the one to call the flight attendant after finding Margot Laurent lingering near the lavatory entrance, her travel writer's notebook clutched tight against her chest. Now Zara watched Chen Li approach from the economy cabin, her face set in lines of concern, eyes darting between the lavatory door and the closed curtain of the crew rest area beyond. Chen Li stopped a respectful distance away, hands folded neatly in front of her. "I saw Vaughn arguing with her earlier," Chen Li said, her fingers tapping once against her thigh. Not loud but tense, he was insisting she check something in Falk's briefcase while he handled the medication. She looked frightened. Zara nodded slowly. She glanced at her watch, 3:16 a.m., then looked toward the lavatory door. Laurent was here too. I saw her slip inside. Chen Li's eyebrows lifted slightly. Zara held her gaze. The secretary was found just now. Chen Li's voice dropped. 2 minutes. That's all it would take to press something into her hand. Zara's eyes flicked to the lavatory door again, or to slip something into her drink while she was washing her hands. A sharp knock came at the crew rest area door. Margot Laurent entered without waiting for an invitation, her travel writer's guise of fragile vulnerability replaced by something sharper, more alert. Her French-inflected English carried no sigh this time, only directness. "I need to know what you found in that vial," she stated, her eyes fixed on Cadfael's hand. "Was it Falk's or something else?" Cadfael met her gaze levelly. "It was not Falk's medicine. It is a hospital-only phenobarbital capsule." Laurent's nostrils flared briefly, a flash of annoyance or calculation. "Vaughan had access to such things," Margot Laurent said, leaning in so her breath stirred Chen Li's collar, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He worked at Aldershot. He knew Falk was about to expose him for stealing diplomatic documents." Berengar pushed forward, his Norman wit edged with steel. "And you had motive to want the secretary silenced. You were seen entering the lavatory 2 minutes before she was found." Laurent's breath hitched, almost imperceptibly. "I was checking on her. She looked unwell. I offered assistance." Chen Li stepped forward, her voice calm but edged with steel. Vaughan argued with her about Falk's briefcase. He seemed agitated. He needed her to look at something while he handled the pills. Zara Al-Mansouri added, her tone measured. "Laurent's timing is suspicious. Li's observation of the argument is corroborative." Berengar held up a hand, stopping the flow. "We are not here to accuse. We are here to establish opportunity and motive." He turned to Cadfael. "The powder matches hospital formulation. Vaughan has the background. Laurent and Li place him near the secretary at the critical time." Cadfael nodded, the gesture slow and thoughtful. The killer did not rely on Falk's own supplies. They brought their own, someone with military medical training. Laurent's eyes flicked to the lavatory door, or someone who wanted it to look like Falk had access to military drugs through his assistant. Berengar's jaw tightened like a drawn bowstring, or someone who wanted to frame Vaughan. The lavatory door clicked open. A flight attendant emerged, her face pale. "She's awake," she announced, asking for water. Zara Al-Mansouri exchanged a glance with Chen Li. "We should let her speak," Zara said softly, "before anyone else gets to her." Berengar moved toward the door, his steps silent on the carpet. Cadfael remained at the table, the vial still in his hand. He turned it once more, catching the light. Cadfael frowned, recalling Falk's aversion to capsules. Outside, the plane began its final descent into New York, the engines whining a steady pitch as the ground rushed up to meet them. Berengar paused at the lavatory threshold, his hand on the latch. "Ask her what Vaughan said to her," he murmured without turning, "and if she saw Laurent hand her anything." Cadfael did not look up. His focus remained on the vial, on the mismatch between Falk's white-scored tablet and the capsule powder in his palm. The contradiction sat between them like a stone in still water, simple, undeniable, and utterly destabilizing. Somewhere behind the closed door, the secretary drew a shaky breath, preparing to speak. The secretary's voice came through the door, thin but clear. He said, "Check the briefcase for the will amendment." Zara Al-Mansouri's head snapped toward the sound. "And Laurent?" Berengar asked, his voice low. "Did she give you anything?" There was a pause, the sound of a glass being set down. "No," the secretary replied. "She only asked if I was okay." Chen Li stepped closer to the door, her face a closed ledger. "Vaughan seemed angry when you refused," she said. "He said Falk would not tolerate disobedience." The secretary's breath hitched. He said I should be grateful he didn't report me for incompetence." Laurent's voice came from just outside the crew rest area, soft and wounded. "I was only trying to help." Berengar's eyes narrowed. Help her lie or help her stay silent. The vial in Cadfael's hand dragged downward, the powder inside a silent accusation. Hugh Berengar stood in the galley kitchenette, the aircraft's medical manifest spread across the fold-down table. The stewardess had handed it over after he mentioned Vaughan's name, her eyes flicking to the sealed door of the cockpit where the captain monitored instruments. Berengar traced a finger down the list, past bandages and antiseptic, until he found it. Phenobarbital capsules, signed out at 14:22 GMT, initial DV, the time matched when Vaughn had been alone with Falk in the forward cabin, according to the flight attendant's log. He noted the dosage: 2 capsules, exactly what had been found in Falk's air sickness bag. The stewardess watched him, waiting. Was this standard procedure for Mr. Vaughn, he asked, keeping his voice even. She shook her head. Only if the passenger requested it specifically, and he did not. Brother Cadfael leaned against the bulkhead near seat 12F, observing Vaughn as he sat rigidly upright, hands clasped on his knees. The Welshman's jaw worked slightly, a habit Cadfael had noticed when Vaughn lied. Falk had once told him, over brandy in his study, that he disliked capsules. They feel like swallowing secrets, Falk had said, rubbing his temples. I need to see what I'm taking. Cadfael recalled the moment vividly, the way Falk had pushed the glass of water away when Vaughn offered it with the 2-part pill. Now, watching Vaughn's throat constrict as he swallowed, Cadfael understood. The capsule had not been Falk's choice. It had been Vaughn's. The secretary, Ellen Sjöström's former assistant, sat wrapped in a blanket near the rear lavatory, her eyes red-rimmed. Hugh Berengar approached slowly, notebook open. You said Vaughn told you to check Falk's briefcase for a will amendment, he began. She nodded, twisting the edge of the blanket. He said Falk wanted to know if the trust clause was generous. Berengar paused. And you saw the amendment? She hesitated. No. I found the briefcase locked. Vaughn said Falk must have locked it himself. Her voice dropped. He also said if I told anyone about the capsule, he'd report me for incompetence. Berengar closed his notebook. Thank you. He walked away, leaving her staring at the floor. Pierre Lefebvre sipped coffee in his seat 3 rows behind, watching the exchange. When Berengar slid into the seat beside him, the Frenchman did not start. You think Vaughn acted alone? Pierre asked, his accent thickening. Berengar shook his head. He had help getting the phenobarbital, someone with access to military stores. Pierre's gaze drifted to the window where the Atlantic stretched gray and endless. Aldershot closed its military hospital in '72. The stores went to civilian contractors. He paused. But Vaughn kept connections. Old habits die hard. Berengar noted the vagueness. Pierre avoided eye contact when Vaughn was mentioned, his grip tightening on his coffee cup. Margot Laurent stood by the galley, refilling her glass with water. She caught Cadfael's eye as he passed. He gave her the capsule, she said softly, nodding toward Vaughn. I saw him press it into Falk's palm. Cadfael stopped, and Falk took it without water? Margot's lips tightened. He did. He looked confused afterward. She touched her throat. Falk hated capsules. He always complained about them. Cadfael recalled Falk's words. Margot pressed her lips together. He gave her the capsule. I saw him press it into Falk's palm. She nodded toward Vaughn, then added. He also checked the briefcase after Falk dozed off. Without another word, she turned and walked away. Vaughan rose abruptly, his chair scraping the floor. I need air, he stated, voice clipped. He moved toward the forward cabin, passing Berengar, who stood to block the aisle. Where do you think you're going? Berengar asked, hands loose at his sides. Vaughan's eyes flicked to the cockpit door. The lavatory. Berengar shook his head. The rear lavatory. You were there 2 minutes before the secretary was found. Vaughan's face flushed, his Welsh lilt surfacing. I was checking on her. She looked pale. Berengar stepped aside. Of course, Vaughn hurried past, disappearing behind the curtain. Berengar watched him go, then turned to Cadfael. He's hiding something. Cadfael let the weight of the words settle, his gaze fixed on Vaughan's retreating form. Look at his left cuff. Berengar leaned forward. There, where the sleeve met the wrist, a faint gray powder clung to the wool identical to the phenobarbital crystals found in the air sickness bag. Cadfael spoke quietly. He didn't clean up properly, or he wanted us to see. Berengar exhaled. Either way, it's proof. The seatbelt sign chimed as the plane began its descent over New York. Vaughan returned, his face composed, and slid into his seat without a word. The mystery was not solved, but the trail was clear. Hugh Berengar closed the medical manifest, the phenobarbital signature burning in his mind. The trail led back to Vaughan's time at Aldershot, where he had signed out controlled substances under false names, a matter quietly resolved after an internal inquiry. Vaughan had not just access, he had motive. Falk was about to expose him for stealing diplomatic documents. The will change, the capsule, the locked garage, all pieces of a design Vaughan had crafted over years of service. Berengar slipped the manifest into his jacket. The plane shuddered as it entered the descent pattern. Somewhere below, a garage waited, its lock turned from the inside. Brother Cadfael watched Vaughan's hands fold neatly in his lap, the powder on his cuff catching the cabin light. Falk had trusted him for 8 years. Vaughan had repaid that trust with betrayal, not of Falk's life alone, but of the quiet understanding between men who had served empires and knew the weight of their choices. Cadfael thought of the garden at the Abbey, where he pulled weeds not to destroy them, but to make space for what would grow. The plane banked over Long Island Sound. The truth would not bring Falk back, but it would clear the ground for justice. Humid Dubai air struck like a wet cloth against skin still chilled from the cabin's recirculated chill as the aircraft door hissed shut behind them. Brother Cadfael adjusted the strap of his worn leather satchel, feeling the familiar weight of his herbal texts and the small notebook where he had scratched observations during the flight. Hugh Berengar stood beside him, one hand resting on the roof of the rental car, the other holding a half-smoked cigarette that had long since gone cold. Neither spoke immediately. The tarmac shimmered under the midday sun, reflecting off the polished fuselage of the jet that had carried them across continents and through a web of deceit. Cadfael cleared his throat before speaking, the sound dry and unused. He took the capsule willingly, he said, eyes fixed on the tarmac. Falk never took pills without water, hated the chalky way they stuck. He paused, then added, yet he took it from Vaughan's hand and tipped his head back. No grimace, no reach for the cup. Berengar exhaled sharply through his nose. Vaughan had to give it to him. Falk wouldn't take it otherwise. His gaze lifted to the jet. Then Vaughan moved him to the garage, shoved him in the car, and locked it from the outside. We found the key in Vaughan's shaving kit. The younger man flicked ash onto the tarmac, watching it scatter in the heat haze. The engine running, the exhaust building, it looked like suicide, a tired old man overcome by fumes in his own garage. But Falk would never have left the engine running unattended. He was too precise for that. Cadfael nodded, a slow dip of his chin. Vaughan knew that. He counted on the appearance of accident to buy time, to sell those documents before anyone questioned the will. He paused, choosing his words with care. The phenobarbital in the cuff, the capsule in the airsickness bag, the locked briefcase. It was a chain, each link forged by Vaughan's hand. Berengar crushed the cigarette butt under his heel, the action decisive. He acted alone. No one else had access to the military hospital phenobarbital. No one else knew Falk's routine well enough to time the dose. He turned to face Cadfael fully, the planes of his face holding no light. The red herrings, the torn prospectus, the garbled airphone call, the blowfly eggs, they were noise. Vaughan planted some of them himself, I suspect, to scatter our attention. Cadfael smiled faintly, a gesture that held no warmth. A clever man, too clever for his own good. They stood in silence for a moment, watching ground crew maneuver a baggage cart toward the terminal. The scent of jet fuel and hot asphalt mingled with the distant tang of the sea. The taste of dust lingered in Cadfael's mouth as he watched the jet fade. Cadfael murmured, more to himself than to Berengar. Falk's crimes against the Kikuyu will never be answered in a court. Vaughan will answer for murder, but the larger theft, the land, the lives remains unjudged. Berengar shifted his weight, his jaw tightening. We exposed the lie, we returned the will to its true intent. That is enough for now. Cadfael turned toward the airport building, his steps deliberate despite the ache in his knees from years of marching and gardening. "Come," he said, "let us see if the trust funds have been secured." Berengar fell into step beside him, the rhythm of their walk falling into an easy pattern, two men accustomed to moving side by side through uncertain terrain. The departure board flashed overhead, listing destinations in languages neither needed to read. Somewhere beyond those gates, a widow in Nairobi would learn her name had been restored to a document meant to heal, not to harm. As they passed through the sliding doors, the cool interior air greeted them like a promise. Cadfael paused at the information desk, his hand resting lightly on the counter. One moment, he said to the attendant behind the glass, "I need to make a telephone call." Berengar waited, watching the monk's fingers dial the rotary phone with deliberate care. The conversation that followed was brief, spoken in low tones, but the nod Cadfael gave at its end spoke of resolution. He replaced the receiver and turned to his companion. The will had been located. The funds were safe. The killer was in custody. Outside, the sun continued its descent toward the horizon, painting the runway in gold and bruised violet. Cadfael slipped his notebook back into his satchel, the weight of it familiar and comforting. He did not look back at the aircraft. He walked forward, Berengar at his shoulder, into the quiet hum of a world that had for a moment been set right.